Forgotten is a relative term. Some of the games on this list have dedicated communities who never stop talking about them. Some were known at the time and faded. Some were too obscure to ever find a wide audience and are only now being rediscovered. What they share is that they still offer something you can't easily find anywhere else. A design idea, a setting, a system, a tone that the 30 years of games following them didn't replicate cleanly. Panzer Dragoon Saga is a Saturn RPG that Sega released in North America in a print run of roughly 30,000 units. The same year, Final Fantasy VII had shipped over 3 million copies domestically. Complete copies now regularly sell for several $100s to over $1,000. The game spent years inaccessible to anyone who hadn't kept their copy, which created both its legendary reputation among Saturn owners and its near-total invisibility to everyone else. Emulation has gradually made it more accessible, which finally allows the reputation to be tested against the actual game rather than against its myth. Team Andromeda built an active 3D battle system around the Panzer Dragoon series on-rail dragon shooting. Edge and his dragon move freely on a 360-degree sphere around enemies, positioning for vulnerable spots while managing berserk energy for special attacks. The further behind an enemy you position, the weaker their defenses apply. The dragon evolves forms based on your combat behavior throughout the entire run. Aggressive play producing a different form than magic-focused play, with no explicit indication of which direction you're pushing the evolution until it shifts. The story, delivered mostly without dialogue in its early segments through environmental observation and implication, follows awakening conflict in ancient ruins. The world design draws from Mobius and Geiger and looks nothing like any other RPG of the period. As a visual and systemic experience, it remains entirely distinct from everything around it, which explains why people keep paying what they pay for a physical copy and why emulation communities have prioritized preserving access to it over so many other Saturn exclusives. Magic Knight Rayearth on the Sega Saturn, one of the last officially released Saturn games, is a working designs localization of a Game Arts action RPG based on Clamp's manga, and it's the game that most thoroughly demonstrates the gap between the Saturn's capabilities and its commercial failure. The sprite work is extraordinary. Large, detailed character sprites with fluid animations, elaborately designed enemy sprites, and pre-rendered backgrounds that push the Saturn's quadrilateral polygon renderer in ways most developers hadn't figured out. The anime cutscenes produced for the Saturn version were high quality enough that working designs included an anime video as a pack-in bonus. 3 heroines are summoned and must free the imprisoned Princess Emerald. The action RPG combat is fast and character-specific, with each heroine's abilities reflecting her archetype from the source material. The working designs localization added difficulty and humor in their characteristic fashion. The game is short, around 15 hours, and the dungeon design is more straightforward than its visual presentation suggests. As one of the final Saturn games officially distributed in North America, it became a collector's item before most people knew it existed, and its current prices reflect that scarcity more than the quality of the experience. But as a Saturn showcase, as evidence of what the platform could produce in its final commercial year, it remains one of the best arguments for why the system deserved more time. Arx Fatalis is Arcane Studios' first-person dungeon RPG. The studio's first game from 2002, before Dishonored or Prey, and it's the most direct spiritual successor to Ultima Underworld ever built. Set underground in a world where the sun has died and civilization retreated into cavern networks, the game follows a prisoner who wakes in a dungeon without memory and gradually pieces together what happened to the surface. The level design is interconnected in the immersive sim tradition. An underground city where the bakery, the tavern, the troll market, and the dwarven quarter are physically adjacent and navigable in any order, each with its own population and internal logic. The magic system draws from Ultima Underworld's rune mechanic. Combining runes drawn with the mouse produces spells, and the combination space is large enough that the game never fully teaches it. Experimentation reveals effects the documentation doesn't list. Drawing quickly in combat produces weaker effects than careful casting outside it. Cooking combines ingredients into food with stat bonuses. NPCs and enemies follow schedules. You can ignite torches with a fire rune, freeze water to walk across it, and use spells to solve puzzles in ways that feel discovered rather than scripted. Arcane built it after licensing the Ultima Underworld engine from Looking Glass Studios, which shut down mid-development and required Arcane to finish without its original support structure. The official open-source port has kept it running on modern systems since 2011 and remains the recommended way to play it. Dark Cloud 2, also known as Dark Chronicle in Japan, is Level 5's PS2 action RPG and one of the most mechanically generous games the console produced, that too in 2005. The roguelite dungeon crawling, the diorama city building system, the weapon development tree, the photography and invention system, the golf minigame, the enemy transformation abilities. These aren't separate modes awkwardly grafted together, but an integrated loop where each system produces resources for the others. Photographing enough flowers unlocks a new invention. Inventions unlock dungeon abilities. Dungeon abilities find better diorama materials. The diorama pieces advance the story. Every session produces progress across multiple dimensions simultaneously without requiring you to prioritize one over the others. Max uses guns and wrenches. Monica uses swords and armlets for transforming into specific enemy types to use their abilities. Weapon development is granular and always visible, which prevents the grind from feeling punishing. You always know what you're working toward and why. The cel-shaded visuals aged exceptionally well, outlasting the photorealistic PS2 games around it, and still reading as distinctly charming. The story is the weakest element. Time travel framing, personality-type protagonists, a villain who generates minimal interest. None of that changes a game that rewards engagement with its interconnected systems more generously than almost anything on the platform. The diorama construction specifically scratches a design itch that sandbox city builders don't quite replicate, because the building here is tied to narrative rather than abstracted from it. The Age of Decadence is Iron Tower Studios' isometric CRPG from 2015, and the most uncompromising choice and consequence RPG since Fallout. Set in a post-apocalyptic world modeled on the fall of the Roman Empire, 3 noble houses, a collapsed empire, ruins containing pre-war technology nobody fully understands. The game operates on a rule most RPGs pay lip service to, and this actually enforces. You cannot do everything. Joining one faction locks you out of others permanently. Quest close as you make decisions. A single playthrough reveals maybe 40% of the content, and the game is explicitly designed to be played multiple times to assemble the full picture. The skill system is classless. 8 character backgrounds determine starting stats, but not future direction. 23 skills from Dagger and Critical Strike to Persuasion, Impersonate, and Lore. Combat is turn-based, tactical, and brutal. A poorly built character dies repeatedly, and the game honestly acknowledges that some builds are not combat viable and should use every available non-combat route to avoid fighting. 7 different endings exist based on cumulative choices. No experience levels. Skill points come from completing quests and winning fights. The writing is exceptional and dry. The world's history is delivered through conversation and discovered documents, and the factions pursuing power are all wrong in specific ways the game refuses to judge. Eternal Sonata is a RPG from Tricrescendo with a premise specific enough to describe in one sentence. Frédéric Chopin, dying of tuberculosis in Paris in 1849, is dreaming a fantasy world in his final hours. Chopin himself is a playable character. His actual compositions play throughout the game, performed by a live orchestra. His real biography arrives in chapter break documentary segments with historical photographs and explanatory context. The premise creates a melancholy register that persists through the gameplay and makes the world feel inhabited by a dying consciousness rather than simply constructed as a backdrop for combat. The battle system runs in real time with action timers. Characters act when their gauge fills, and during their window, move freely in the arena with a limited attack count before the timer expires. The light and shadow mechanic is the distinctive layer. Abilities change based on whether a character stands in a lit or shadowed area of the battlefield. Some attacks work only in light, some only in shadow, and the arena design creates situations where managing that positioning is a real tactical consideration alongside movement and attack sequencing. The visuals are cel-shaded and color-saturated, with environments that reference Chopin's musical themes directly. The design coherence between the musical source material and the visual presentation is unusual for the era. At around 15 hours, it's shorter than most comparable JRPGs, polished throughout, and the historical fantasy premise is entirely unrepeatable. Nobody else used a real composer's dying hours as the frame for a fantasy RPG, and nobody probably will. Radiata Stories is Triace's 2005 PS2 RPG with 175 recruitable characters, a number more meaningful than it sounds because each one has a name, a daily schedule, a home location, and dialogue specific to their personal history and relationship with protagonist Jack Russell. The world runs on a 24-hour cycle. Characters wake, travel to work, eat at taverns, return home. Running into a character by literally bumping into them with your body opens a response option. Some react with friendship, some with irritation that builds to a side quest, some reveal lore about their background. Moving through the city feels like navigating a real social space rather than working a mechanic. A story choice splits the game at a specific narrative moment into the human faction route or the non-human faction route, with the two paths covering different content and ending differently. Getting all 175 characters requires multiple play-throughs since some are mutually exclusive across the split. The combat is real-time with chain attacks requiring precise timing and sequence with party members. The early hours are deliberately slow, and the overall story is simpler than the world density suggests. But the scheduling system, the recruitable roster, and the social reaction mechanic represent Triace at their most experimental. A game that devoted more design energy to making a world feel populated than to the plot those people inhabit. No JRPG before or after approached character density world simulation in the same way. And the result is a game that rewards wandering more than it rewards following the story. Dragon Force is a Saturn strategy RPG where every battle puts up to 200 soldiers on screen in real time. You command a general who commands squad leaders who each command soldiers. The hierarchy produces the 100 per side maximum. The battle unfolds as formations charge each other while you issue high-level commands. Attack, defend, flank, fall back. Outcome depends on unit type matchups, terrain, morale as squads take casualties, and general abilities activated at critical moments. The scale of each engagement places it between a tactics game and a war game in feel, and it runs in real time on Saturn hardware, without the slowdown most developers avoided by staying turn-based. 8 playable rulers have distinct campaigns with different starting positions, political relationships, and story content that partially overlaps. A playthrough with one character covers different events than another, and completing multiple campaigns assembles the larger story from different angles. Working Design's localization was unusually careful, one of the better scripts in their catalog. The game never appeared on any platform besides the Saturn and has never been re-released, making emulation the only real path to it for most players. The combat system has no clean equivalent in 30 years of successors. Most strategy RPGs choose turn-based or fully real-time, and Dragon Force's real-time mass battle hybrid with RPG character development remained its own genre. Saturn exclusivity and collector pricing kept it obscure for nearly 3 decades. So emulation is the practical recommendation. Under Rail is Stygian Software's isometric CRPG set in a post-apocalyptic underground metro network. Not natural caves, but actual rail infrastructure repurposed as civilization after the surface became uninhabitable. The factions competing in this space include democratic stations, cult communes, corporate mercenaries, and deep creature infestations, and the game maps each faction's political logic with the same care it brings to combat. The turn-based tactical fights run on action points, with every weapon type having specific mechanics: shotgun spread calculations, crossbow bolt crafting and type selection, psi ability pools depleting and recharging differently from physical stamina. The crafting system is the most involved in any CRPG of the era. Components found throughout the world combine into specialized gear with properties that depend on the quality of individual parts. A knife made from better steel and a better handle performs measurably differently. Psi abilities, biocognition, metathermics, psychokinesis, constitute a complete alternative combat system for players who prefer it. The early hours are the hardest. The learning curve is steep, and the first area is designed around failure. The Expedition DLC adds a region and content roughly equivalent to a full second game. Under Rail is actively maintained years after release, and the developer has continued adding content and refining balance without moving on to a sequel. The underground setting, the social specificity of metro station communities, remains entirely its own thing.
How can I help you?
The Temple of Elemental Evil is Troika's adaptation of the Gary Gygax and Frank Mincer D&D module, and it contains the most faithful computer implementation of D&D 3.5 rules ever made. Every feat, every class ability, every grapple rule, every attack of opportunity, every flanking bonus, all of it for the player's handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, implemented without simplification. Players who knew 3.5 deeply found a tactical combat simulator of extraordinary mechanical richness. Players who didn't found a game that expected knowledge they didn't have, with no meaningful onboarding to bridge the gap. Troika shipped it broken, missing content, crashes throughout, quests that failed to complete correctly, and the Circle of 8 modding community spent years fixing what Atari's release schedule prevented the developers from finishing. The Co-8 patch is now considered mandatory. Adds restored cut content, including a new starting village and additional NPC interactions, and has kept the game running on modern systems across multiple OS generations. The village of Hamlet and the temple itself are faithful enough to the original tabletop module that players who ran it in the 1980s recognize specific rooms, encounters, and faction relationships. The story doesn't extend meaningfully past the module's scope. It's fundamentally a dungeon crawl with minimal narrative outside the dungeon. But as a dungeon crawl, it's the most mechanically rigorous the genre has produced, and as a D&D rules implementation, it's the benchmark that no subsequent licensed or unlicensed game has fully matched.
Oh, that hurts.
Wizardry 8 came out in November 2001, distributed exclusively through Electronics Boutique, and sold well enough for SurTech Canada to survive the release before the studio closed in 2003. It's the last entry in the series that invented the first-person dungeon crawler in 1981, functioning as both a standalone and the conclusion of a save-import trilogy, carrying the same party from Wizardry 6 through 7 and into this game represents a character investment across a decade of development. Continuous in a way the genre has never replicated at that scale before or since. 6 character parties build from 15 classes and 11 races, with all stats running to 100 and skills advancing through use rather than purely through level ups. Personality traits generate unique voiced NPC reactions throughout the run. Combat takes place in the actual 3D environments you're exploring. No separate combat screen, with turn order based on speed stats and formation positioning, because enemies engage at range and flank you. The planet Dominus mixes science fiction and high fantasy without explanation. Alien Trang mercenaries, Umpany shock troops, and ancient dungeon architecture occupy the same zone, and the world assumes you'll find the combination natural. The encounter rate is high and the enemy design creative throughout. Brenda Romero designed it knowing it was the series' final entry. Surtech offered no sequel and closed. The sense of stakes attached to characters carried over from earlier games is something faster progression dungeon RPGs don't replicate. Darklands is a 1992 RPG by Microprose set in the 15th century Holy Roman Empire, and it's the most historically committed RPG ever made. Every city on the map existed in medieval Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Poland. The calendar is the medieval Christian one, time measured in liturgical hours. Characters age in real time and eventually retire from active service. No experience levels. Skills improve incrementally through use, the way Elder Scrolls games would later develop. No character classes. A friar, an alchemist, a knight, and a thief are differentiated by background and skill investment rather than locked templates. Magic as a system doesn't exist. In its place, alchemy drawing on historical recipes for potions and reagents, and prayer to Catholic saints with specific intercessory domains. Saint Dunstan blesses weapons before battle. Saint Christopher protects travelers in wilderness. Different saints address different threats. Monsters come from Germanic folklore. Kobolds, the wild hunt, witches gathering at sabbats, dragons in specific mountain passes. The main quest location is randomized each game. Microprose shipped knowing it had severe bugs in 1992, and patches arrived by modem and diskette for months afterward. The historical specificity remains entirely unreplicated. KCED is the closest spiritual successor, operating in the same historical register with a different structural approach. Betrayal at Kronder is a RPG set in Raymond Ife's mid-Chemia world, and it has the best writing of any RPG from its era. Better than the Ultima games, better than the gold box titles, better than every other Sierra game around it. The prose isn't just good for a game. It holds up against the fantasy novels it's adapting. The first chapter structure, Jimmy the Hand, the Knight Locklear, and a Mordhell enemy named Gorith investigating something wrong in the kingdom. Uses genuine mystery architecture and chapter-length arcs, with consistent prose and character voices maintained across hundreds of individual encounters and exchanges. The emotional intelligence of the writing is the reason the game has never been forgotten by people who played it. Combat runs on a hex grid with facing and positional damage multipliers. Locked chests require mathematical reasoning to open without a key, a specific puzzle format that has never been widely replicated. Experience applies to specific skills used in combat rather than globally, so neglected abilities fall behind while used ones advance. The outdoor world is enormous from the opening hour, and the game trusts you to navigate it without waypoints or objective markers. Sierra made the game available for free download years after release, and GOG now hosts it at no cost. A spiritual successor came out after Sierra lost the Feist license and used a generic world instead. It's weaker in every dimension Kronder excels at. Nothing else has replicated what Kronder did with licensed fantasy writing. The dialogue reads like Feist's actual prose rather than a game approximating it 3 decades later.